Adowa, Ethiopia, 1896. The air is filled with the sounds of gunfire and the screams of men as an epic battle rages around you. You are a young Ethiopian warrior determined to drive the white invaders from your land. Ahead of you is a strong Italian force battling your cavalry. Again and again, your horsemen charge into a wall of lead, many falling from their mounts dead. The Italians are getting overconfident, cheering their supposed success, jeering at their enemy. Little do they know that the horsemen are just a distraction. The real danger is coming from behind. Too late, an Italian officer on a horse spots the trap and tries to warn his men. Then you're amongst them. An Italian soldier with a bushy beard fires his rifle. You feel the bullet graze your cheek. Before he can fire again, you punch him in the face as blood flows from his nose, then thrust your lance into his guts. The fight goes hand to hand, a melee of sword, bayonet and lance. Through the confusion of battle, you see the Italian officer. He has lost his horse and is fighting on foot. He shoots dead 2 of your comrades with his pistol, before turning towards you and pulling the trigger. Click! He's out of bullets. Throwing away his pistol, he draws his sword, and you fight it out, 1-on-1. He is a good swordsman, and it's a tough fight, but you get a lucky stab to his leg. As he falls to the floor, you thrust your lance deep into his chest. The battle is far from won, but the Italians are fighting for conquest and plunder. You are fighting for God and your freedom. In your bones, you know you will carry the field. The Italians shall not pass. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we head to the mountains of Ethiopia for one of the worst defeats ever suffered by a European colonial power. The new Italian nation, with dreams of building a new Roman Empire, ran headlong into one of the world's oldest countries. The war that followed would have huge consequences for the future of both nations. Let us head to the last years of the 19th century as the age of high imperialism reaches its peak. Despite Italy's rich and ancient history, the modern nation-state that we know today only dates back to 1860. For centuries, Italy had been more of a geographical expression than a nation, divided into multiple city-states and kingdoms. It was only with the Risorgimento, or rebirth, that occurred in the 1850s and 1860s that Italy would be unified for the first time since the days of Rome. The fragile new nation was plagued by problems such as widespread illiteracy, abject poverty, especially in the south, slow economic growth, and a bitter feud with the Catholic Church. To explain that last one, the Pope was angry that the Papal States had been annexed into the new kingdom. He would not forgive that for a long time. With all these problems, you would think Italy's politicians had enough on their plates. Why did they suddenly want to build a colonial empire? Partly because, when politicians face intractable and difficult-to-solve problems domestically, they look abroad to distract their populations. In particular, for Italy, immigration was becoming a real issue. It was not like today, where the issue is people coming in. Instead, it was the millions of Italians leaving the country due to poverty. Huge Italian populations were building up in the USA, South America, and other parts of Europe. The brain drain was getting embarrassing. rather than solving the problems that made people immigrate in the first place. Instead, Italy's politicians wanted a quick fix. If Italy had colonies, then people could immigrate there instead. Problem solved, no more embarrassment. At the same time, imperialism was all the rage by the late 19th century. If you wanted to be one of the great powers of the day, a colony or two was the price of admission to the club. Rather like if you want to join the cool kid clique at school. You need the right clothes or latest phone. France, Britain and Russia already had vast legacy empires they were continuing to add to, while Germany, America, and even Japan were getting in on the act of carving up the globe. A unified Italy was desperate to regain the grandeur of the old Roman Empire. To do that, it needed to grab some colonies before the spoils were all gone. That it would be East Africa where these ambitions would play out was due to the meddling of the British. We had to be involved somewhere. Up until 1885, Eritrea, the small strip of sun-bleached land separating Ethiopia from the Red Sea, was controlled by the Egyptians. They had tried to build an empire along the course of the Nile River, including multiple failed invasions of Ethiopia itself. All it succeeded in doing was bankrupting the Egyptian state, losing both its empire and its independence. As Egypt pulled out of Eritrea, Britain was worried that France might take it over. They already had a small but strategically placed colony called Djibouti nearby. Obsessed with the safety of the Suez Canal and the route to India, but not wanting the expense of ruling Eritrea themselves, they looked for a weaker power who could take over. The obvious choice was Ethiopia itself, which they had good relations with at the time. However, the British didn't take them seriously as a regional power, so instead they opted to encourage the Italians to grab their first colony. It was pretty shoddy behaviour from Britain. Historian Augustus Wilde condemned it as one of our worst bits of business out of the many we have been guilty of in Africa, one of the vilest bits of treachery. Italy, on the other hand, was overjoyed. The newspaper El Diritto claimed that Italy must be ready. The year 1885 will decide her fate as a great power. Soon, Italian forces were moving inland, seeking to seize territory from Ethiopia as well. In their haste and arrogance, they did little to understand the power they were now challenging. Ethiopia, also known by its old name of Abyssinia, was one of the toughest warrior societies in the whole of Africa. It was a feudal state, with the emperor technically ruling supreme, but in reality reliant upon powerful warlords known as Ras to provide him with troops. While often fighting each other, they were fiercely proud of their nation, their Orthodox Christian faith, and ancient history. The monarchy claimed to trace their lineage all the way back to the Queen of Sheba in the Old Testament. Thanks to the mountains they lived in and their warrior ways, they had defeated almost every opponent foolish enough to invade. Italy really should have done its research. After brief clashes, an Italian force was besieged at a fort called Sati. 500 men under Colonel de Christoforus was sent to relieve them, but they fell into a trap. Just outside the village of Dogali, they were ambushed by a huge army of Ethiopians, outnumbering them 14-1. What happened next is still a legend in today's Italian army. Let's head there now. Frantically, you run to a nearby hill as thousands of Ethiopian soldiers charge towards you. This was meant to be an easy mission, to relieve a besieged garrison. Now you are fighting for your life against the largest force you have ever seen. Frantically, you pour lead into the advancing warriors. Many fall screaming. However, they had their own sharpshooters. Soon your own ranks begin to thin as their bullets find their targets with alarming accuracy. Your machine guns soon overheat and fall silent as the soldier next to you drops his rifle and slides to the floor dead. They have surrounded the hill, forcing you to fight on all sides. Your ammunition is running out, and soon your rifle is useless. Sensing the weakening fire, the Ethiopians charge up the hill as you fight back with your bayonet. You realize that this hill is going to be your final resting place. "407 Italians died that day. Only 81 wounded men were able to escape. Italy had been trying to do imperialism on the cheap and had sent out their troops with barely enough ammunition, condemning them to defeat. For the Italian army, it became a legend known as the Dogali massacre. Colonel de Christophorus and his men were praised as the heirs of Leonidas and his Spartans, who had defended Thermopylae, heroes who had died fighting for a noble cause. For now, though, Italy withdrew back to its coastal strongholds. It wasn't done meddling in Ethiopian affairs, however. Not if Francisco Crispi had anything to say about it. Where to start with Crispi? A distinguished-looking gentleman with a huge bushy white moustache, he was one of the figures who dominated the Italian political scene at this time. Earning the nickname the Loner for his relentless ambition, he loved three things: women, a brown envelope filled with cash, and aggressive Italian nationalism. Crispi indulged in all three with a massive appetite. He was actually convicted of bigamy after being married to 3 women at the same time, while also having multiple mistresses. Whenever a major corruption scandal erupted, his name was sure to be mentioned, and he often helped cover them up. As for nationalism, he wanted colonies for Italy and, quote, the grandeur of a second Roman Empire, end quote. When it came to foreign relations, Crispi's approach was rather like an angry drunk in a bar, challenging everyone to a fight if they think they're hard enough. To give an example, during a 3-month period in 1895, he talked quite openly about attacking France, sent a naval squadron to the eastern Mediterranean to prepare for a possible war with the Ottoman Empire in order to seize Albania, wanted to send an expeditionary force to seize a city in China, and planned to send a force to South Africa to forcibly mediate the dispute between Great Britain and the Transvaal Republic. Those who knew him by this stage of his life considered Crispi to be almost mindlessly bellicose, as he broke off diplomatic relations with Portugal over a supposed slight, saying he deserved more respect from this entirely unimportant country, ruled over by this minuscule monarchy. Even King Umberto I, no slouch in the imperialism department himself, lamented that Crispi wants to occupy everywhere, even China and Japan. As if he wasn't busy enough attempting to start fights with half the world, he also turned his attention to Ethiopia. Events there seemed to offer an opportunity to avenge the defeat at Dogali. The old emperor of Ethiopia, Johannes, died after being wounded in battle. On his deathbed, he revealed that the 25-year-old Ras Mengesha was his natural son by the wife of his own brother, recommending that he succeed him. I have often thought that if Johannes and Crispi had met, they would have got on famously. Even for the royal court, siring a son with your brother's wife was a bit much. Mengesha was pushed aside by the Ras of central Ethiopia, Menelik. Seeking influence, the Italians backed Menelik in this Game of Thrones, and then tried one of the oldest tricks in the book when it comes to empire building. A treaty that says different things in different languages. Under the Treaty of Wajul, Ethiopia recognised Italy's control of Eritrea in exchange for weaponry and funds to modernise their country. However, the Italian negotiators tried a sneaky trick. In the Italian version of the treaty, it stated that His Majesty, the King of Kings of Ethiopia, consents to avail himself of the government of His Majesty the King of Italy for all negotiations in affairs which he may have with other powers or governments. In this version, Menelik had apparently agreed to turn his country into an Italian protectorate. However, in the Ethiopian version of the treaty, written in Amharic, it stated that the emperor could choose to turn to the Italian government in his dealings with foreign powers. A furious Emperor Menelik soon discovered the deception and denounced Italy's attempt, under the mask of friendship, to take possession of Ethiopia. All the while, as the treaty dispute went on, Italian forces were nibbling away at Ethiopia's northern border. War was coming. Ironically, Italy had greatly strengthened the very nation it wanted to subdue. Their relentless demands and seizure of territory had united the previously divided Ethiopia. Even Ras Mengesa, who had challenged Menelik for the throne, now bowed before him and accepted his leadership. The country was swept by a popular refrain: "Of the black snake's bite you may be cured, but from the bite of a white snake you will never recover." Hard to argue with that one in the age of high imperialism. All those funds that Italy had sent to Ethiopia under the treaty had been put to good use. Russia trained Ethiopian warriors how to use modern artillery and guided their gun crews. The French, with typical cunning, began supplying Menelik with the latest rifles, hoping to undermine an Italian government that was very pro-German and anti-French. The Ethiopians would go into battle with modern smokeless rifles that didn't give away their positions, and the latest machine guns, far better than anything the Italians would give their troops. One of the myths of this war is that an army of savages defeated the Italians. In no way was that true. This was an army equipped with some of the best weapons available at the time. On top of this, they were led by perhaps the greatest general ever seen in Ethiopian history, Ras Akila. A British diplomat described him as the owner of that powerful, cruel, and intelligent face, who was bound to make his name known in any country, either as a leader or a destroyer of men. But attention at first was riveted to one striking peculiarity: a pair of gleaming tawny eyes. To these flashing yellow orbs, whose effect was aided by a brilliant row of white teeth, was no doubt due much to the terror which Ras Akila was generally regarded. I had seen such eyes in the head of a tiger and of a leopard, but never in that of a human being. He was from Tigray, the very province Italy was now expanding into, and he had been the general who won the Battle of Dogali. For him, this wasn't business, it was very personal. Italy, on the other hand, had the rather lackluster General Oreste Baratieri, a former member of Giuseppe Garibaldi's Red Shirts who had conquered southern Italy. He was utterly unprepared for mountain warfare. He curiously veered between a smug racism that whites couldn't lose against a savage nation, with one Italian being worth 100 Ethiopians, to bouts of worrying that his army wasn't strong enough to do the job. This battle in his own mind would lead to some terrible decisions. He was right to be worried about his army. Crispi was determined to win this war on the cheap, as his government was virtually bankrupt. Baratieri repeatedly said he needed at least 13 million lira to fund the campaign, but Crispi denied this, saying he would only need 9 million. With his general threatening to resign if he didn't see reality, Crispi nonchalantly replied that he must copy Napoleon, who made war with the money of those he conquered. Seemingly forgetting that Napoleon had been fighting in the wealthiest areas of Europe for much of his career, he was ignorant of the fact that there was no way that taxing the poor Ethiopians could fund a military campaign. With a shoestring budget, it is not surprising that the Italian army was in deep trouble. Their equipment was awful. The uniforms were heavy and poorly made, soon turning into rags for which there was no replacements. Boots fell apart in a matter of weeks. Helmets were a bizarre mixture of soda-type hats from India, sombreros, and fezzes with a blue tassel at the end of a string. So the Italian soldiers resembled the village people. Many were issued the old Remington rifles, as the Italian government had a surplus of Remington cartridges and wanted to use them up. Still, despite all these faults, the war seemed to go well at first. The Italians swept through Tigray, conquering an area roughly the size of Ireland. All this for just 324 dead, and best of all, for the penny-pinching Crispi, it only cost 500,000 lira. Crispi boasted in Parliament that for the cost of a nice house in London, he had built a new Roman Empire. Baratieri basked in his victory, promoted to lieutenant general, and received extravagant telegrams of thanks from the king himself. The ease of the victory had a nasty side effect. Crispi believed he had been right to dismiss Baratieri's concerns. This war could be won on the cheap. No more support was coming, but he demanded more conquests. He would have done well to listen to the words of an Ethiopian prisoner of war to his Italian jailers. For the present, you have been victorious, because God so willed it. But wait a month or two, and you will see the soldiers of Menelik, and they are as many in number as the locusts. Emperor Menelik mobilized for war, proclaiming that an enemy is come across the sea. He has broken through our frontiers in order to destroy our fatherland and our faith. I allowed him to seize my possessions and entered upon lengthy negotiations with him in hopes of obtaining justice without bloodshed. But the enemy refuses to listen. He undermines our territories and our people like a mole. Enough! With the help of God, I will defend the inheritance of my forefathers and drive back the invader by force of arms. Let every man who has sufficient strength accompany me, and he who has not, let him pray for us. Nemesis was not long in punishing the Italians. A small Italian force under Major Dogali was pushing forward into Ethiopia, where it was confronted by thousands of Ethiopian warriors led by Emperor Menelik and the infamous Razakula. After taking heavy casualties, Dogali tried to retreat, but the main road had been cut off. Instead, he was forced to take a narrow mountain path, running along a precipice 400 feet high as an escape route. Waiting for them, however, was Razakula. The Italians tried to turn around and flee, but were soon facing a storm of Ethiopian fire, and the retreat turned into utter chaos. A survivor recounted that, "What confusion! Mules rolling over the precipices, wounded men calling for help, and everywhere Abyssinians who were following to fire at us." The Italians lost 20 officers and 1,300 native Ascari soldiers. Including the final toll was Major Dogali, who, exhausted by the retreat, told his troops that, "I am at the end of my strength. Now I will turn about, and they can do what they like." The shell-shock survivors filtered back to General Arimondi's relief column, news of the defeat spreading like wildfire. Razakula was not done by any means. He attacked Arimondi's command with such ferocity that his troops came within 100 yards of the hill the general was using as his headquarters, before being beaten back. Perhaps this near miss unnerved Arimondi, because he now made a huge mistake. Faced with the decision of whether to retreat back to the safety of Eritrea or defend the nearby fort at Mekelle. Filled with tons of precious stores, the general decided instead on a bizarre third option. He would leave over 1,000 soldiers to guard the fort, while he himself would flee to safety with the remaining soldiers. It was an insane decision, as he was leaving most of his force to be completely surrounded by the Ethiopians, with little hope of relief. He would later excuse his conduct by claiming that it would have been demoralizing to abandon the fort, and that he didn't think he had enough food to feed his whole force on its line of retreat. No one believed him, however, with General Baratieri accusing him of cowardice and abandoning his men to save himself. Arimundi also left in charge one of the worst Italian officers in all of Ethiopia, Major Galliano. The key weakness of Mekelle was it was highly reliant on just 2 water sources that would be easy for an enemy to cut off. Did Galliano protect the vital water? No, he did not. He even tore down the defences guarding the water sources, claiming they were unnecessary and the materials could be used elsewhere. As if to prove he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box, Galliano then refused to fill up and store the hundreds of empty bottles in Mekelle with precious water. Instead, he demanded they all be smashed and the glass scattered outside the walls, in the hope they would cut the bare feet of the Ethiopian warriors. As the siege began, both water sources were cut off almost immediately. The ordinary soldiers were reduced to 1 pint of water a day. Galliano refused to share the wine stores until publicly shamed by his fellow officers, which hardly improved morale. With the garrison slowly being worn down by thirst and pounded relentlessly by Ethiopian artillery, they finally surrendered. Fearing the worst, they were actually allowed to go free by the Emperor Menelik. While dismissed as a mere barbarian by his Italian adversaries, Menelik was a skillful politician and propagandist. He knew the war was unpopular back in Italy. Crispi was trying to whip up support by claiming the Ethiopians were, quote, war-crazed black barbarians, end quote, who would commit horrific atrocities on captured Italian soldiers. In one clever move, Menelik completely undermined this argument, even releasing a statement claiming he did it to give proof of his Christian faith. Morale of the Italian home front continued to tumble. By the end of December 1895, Baratieri had lost all the gains he had made in Tigray province. To make matters worse, he had thought the Ethiopians could only assemble a maximum force of 30,000 men. Instead, he was facing an army of over 100,000. In response to the defeats, a wave of anti-war sentiment and defeatism gripped Italy. Crispi being Crispi, he doubled down on his war of expansion. Italy must triumph, whatever the cost. He finally gave Baratieri the money and the resources he'd been begging for, while at home his actions took a distinctly sinister turn. He secretly used public money to bribe journalists to write pro-war articles in the Italian newspapers, while those foreign journalists who reported critically about the war were expelled from the country. For those brave Italian journalists who resisted, fines and violence were used to silence them. Let's head to one such incident. You are the editor at an opposition newspaper in Rome. It is late and everyone is tired, but you and your staff are determined to get the next edition of the paper out tomorrow. The paper is going to expose the corruption and incompetence plaguing Crispi's war in Ethiopia, demanding he end the conflict. It is a nerve-wracking time to be a journalist in Italy. The pressure from the authorities is growing. Well-dressed men with slick smiles have been repeatedly offering you a fortune in cash if the paper changes its stance and starts printing pro-war articles. When you refused, the smiles quickly vanished and the threat started. The last one sneered that you were small fry and could easily be crushed by Don Crispi. An Italian prime minister adopting the title of a head of a mafia family. This war is poisoning Italy. Suddenly, there is a loud knock at the door. Open up. This is the police. They don't wait for you to respond. The door is kicked open, and the police surge inside. You are dragged out along with your fellow journalists, while the copies of tomorrow's newspaper are piled in the street and then set on fire. Horrified, you shout at the police. You can't do this. It's against the law. We have the right to freedom of the press. Their officer sneers and yells back, "Socialist scum," stabbing our soldiers in the back as he hits you in the stomach with his club. Gasping for breath on the floor, a shadow falls over you. Looking up, you see the well-dressed man who had tried to bribe you before. With a sinister smile, he says, "Don Crispi sends his regards." Behind him, you can hear the police smashing up your printing presses. What is happening to your country? The Italian press had always been plagued by bribery and had never been completely free, but Crispi took it to a whole new level. His actions would both inspire and be used to justify the fascist clampdown on the press when they seized power. Desperate for victory, Crispi viciously attacked Baratieri, accusing him of cowardice and incompetence. In one telegram he claimed that, "This is a military wasting disease, not a war. It is clear that there is no fundamental plan in this campaign, and I should like one to be formulated. We are ready for any sacrifice in order to save the honour of the army and the prestige of the monarchy." If Crispi wanted action, his telegram finally provoked it, and put Italy on the road to one of its greatest defeats. Stung by the accusations of cowardice, Baratieri called a war council with his generals. He wanted to withdraw and wait for the Ethiopian army to disintegrate or move on. They had no logistics and were reliant on what they could scavenge. There is no way they could stay in one place much longer. His generals were outraged at the idea, however. Retreat would be dishonourable. They must face and defeat these ignorant savages once and for all. Bowing to the pressure, Baratieri ordered a night attack on the main Ethiopian army. The Battle of Adowa had begun. The Italians had 14,519 men and 56 artillery guns. Ranged against them were 80,000 Ethiopian infantrymen and 9,000 cavalrymen, all armed with the latest rifles and 42 artillery guns. Behind them were 20,000 more warriors armed with swords, spears, and lances. A clash for the ages beckoned. It got off to a bad start for the Italians right away, due to their poor intelligence and dodgy maps. Between the two armies, there were 3 hills which the Italians intended to seize, dig in, and then tempt the Ethiopians to attack. Unbeknownst to Baratieri, an error by his intelligence officers meant that the hill on the left was called Kidan Merit on the Italian maps. This was a mistake. It actually didn't have a name. 4 miles further on, there was another hill that was known to locals as Kidan Merit, however. When General Albertoni was ordered to occupy Kidan Merit, it was to this hill that his native guides led him. Occupying the wrong hill, he was now 4 miles in advance of the rest of the army, completely exposed and destined to be cut off. A major reason why this battle goes so badly for the Italians is that most of the units are not in the right place. This is partly because of bad maps, but also because it was a night attack, and they often lost their way. The night attack was meant to take the Ethiopians by surprise, but the wily Ras Akula had expected this move and left scouts in the mountains to provide an early warning system. As dawn broke, the Ethiopians were fully ready for battle. Albertone's force was the first to feel their wrath. At first his artillery inflicted havoc upon their massed ranks, but soon the Ethiopians' own guns came into action and wiped out his advantage. Thanks to Crispi still trying to conquer on the cheap, each soldier had just 90 rounds of ammunition. Out of bullets, they fixed their bayonets and charged the whirlwind of warriors heading straight for them, shouting their battle cry of "Avanti! Avanti!" Hit by a storm of lead, they were slaughtered. Those that remained were taken prisoner, including Albertone himself. He would spend 10 months as a prisoner of war, famously complaining that he had to wash his own linen without soap in his prison hut. With the left wing of the Italian army destroyed, the Ethiopians surged towards the middle hill. Here, 1,773 riflemen and 2 artillery batteries were commanded by General Aramondi, supported by Baratieri himself. To their horror, they suddenly faced charges by thousands of Ethiopian soldiers. A bloody battle raged for 3 hours, the Ethiopians charging and the Italians beating them back, both sides taking horrific casualties. Finally, to break the deadlock, Emperor Menelik sent in his reserve of 25,000 elite troops. Let's join them for this famous charge. The battle is raging, and you are anxious to join in the fighting. But the Emperor refuses to give the signal. Your heart is beating fast as adrenaline rushes through your veins. The sounds of gunfire and the roar of cannons echoes off the mountains. Finally, the signal is given. Charge the Italian centre. As one, you pour across the battlefield. It is already covered in bodies and pockmarked by shell craters. Italian gunfire rakes your ranks, and many of your fellow warriors fall. But it's less intense than during the other charges. They are running out of ammunition. Finally, you close the gap and leap into the Italian defences. An Italian soldier swings around and raises his rifle, but you are faster. One shot, and he clutches his stomach and falls to the floor. All around you, the fighting has gone hand to hand, but more and more of your fellow soldiers are flooding up the hill like a tidal wave. The Italians finally break and try to flee as you relentlessly pursue them. The fierce joy of fighting for a righteous cause filling your entire body. Having pierced through the Italian centre, the Ethiopians poured through the gap in the line as panic gripped Baratieri's forces. He frantically called for his reserve infantry and artillery to join the fight. It was futile, however. The reserve infantry were quickly overrun. Those that didn't flee were slaughtered. The artillery guns simply clogged up the road the army was using for its retreat, soon being captured by the advancing troops of Menelik. At this point in the battle, the Italian army was beginning to turn into a rabble. Baratieri later wrote that the tail of the column became a confused mass of white men and black men. The Abyssinians, wild with enthusiasm, then rushed in upon them, regardless of losses and death. General Aramondi's mule ran away in the confusion, and he was cut down, along with most of his officers. Only General Debamida's forces on the right remained, but they too would soon be destroyed. Debamida was one of the more competent Italian commanders, but he had taken the wrong path in the dark and had led his entire brigade into a narrow valley, some 3 miles from where he was supposed to be. At first everything was peaceful, The Italian officers even joked about how well the battle must be going. Then suddenly a shot came out of nowhere and hit Major Bola in the elbow. 15,000 Ethiopians descended upon the Italian force of just 3,600 men. We have reached the scene at the start of this podcast. The cavalry charged towards the Italian lines, yelling, "Ibagum," meaning to mow or to reap, to cut down enemies like grass. They were massacred by a storm of Italian fire, then driven back by a charge as the Italian soldiers yelled, "Savoy! Savoy!" after the Italian monarchy, the House of Savoy. With the Ethiopian cavalry fleeing, they celebrated. Then suddenly from behind there came a huge force, led personally by Ras Akula. Taken by surprise, the Italians were completely overrun. As his force crumbled under the pressure, Demamida ordered a retreat. He was last seen muttering to himself that "It is a serious thing, no message, no order, no reinforcement, nothing." His body was never recovered. General Berretieri tried to make a last stand at a local graveyard with just 100 men, yelling, "Viva Italia!" However, the walls of the cemetery were too high to shoot over, so he was soon forced to flee. It really sums up how bad his luck was on this fateful day. The exhausted survivors, who had been without food for more than 12 hours, were now running short of water, staggered on. The Ethiopians lurked on their flanks, taking occasional potshots. Luckily for the Italians, they didn't pursue them with much vigour. The cunning Menelik didn't want to humiliate the Italians so much that they would carry on the fight. He just wanted them to tire of the war and give up any ambitions to conquer Ethiopia. On the battlefield, the Ethiopians celebrated, chanting, "Mow, mow, down the tender grass. The corn of Italy that was sown into grey has been reaped by Menelik, and he has given it to the birds." The Battle of Adowa was a complete disaster for Italy. Out of the proud army of 14,519 who went into action that day, more than 6,000 died, including over 4,000 Italians. Another 1,000 were listed as missing, never to be seen again, while 2,000 were taken prisoner. They had also abandoned all of their artillery and 11,000 rifles. The casualty rate suffered by Italian forces at Adowa was greater than any other major European battle of the 19th century, coming in at about 50%. That even beats Waterloo. Ethiopia, on the other hand, suffered 7,000 killed and 10,000 wounded, a much smaller amount considering they started the battle with 100,000 men. As news of the sheer scale of the defeat reached Italy, would Crispi give up on his warmongering, empire-building ways? Nope, the Italian stallion did not know the words, "This is a disaster, stop!" He declared that he would continue the war against the, quote, "barbarians," end quote, of Ethiopia, claiming he did not care about the lives of the almost 2,000 Italians taken prisoner by the Ethiopians, who were being held as hostages. Apparently, they were expendable compared to the glorious national mission of conquering Ethiopia. Mysteriously, enthusiasm for continuing the war collapsed after these comments. Riots and protests broke out in all of the major Italian cities. Crispi's house was even pelted with rocks by a mob. In Rome, people demonstrated under the slogans, "Death to the King" and "Long live the Republic," as the war had badly damaged the prestige of Umberto I, who had backed Crispi so forcefully and strongly. The writing was on the wall. Crispi's government fell, and his successor sued for peace. Italian soldiers, who had fought bravely under bad generalship and with terrible equipment, were booed and hissed when they arrived back in Italy. Very similar to what happened to Americans who fought in the Vietnam War. Crispi would never again lead Italy. He left a baleful legacy for the nation he claimed to love. Future dictator Benito Mussolini was a great admirer of his, praising him as the father of Italian imperialism. He would both follow and build on Crispi's blueprints of an authoritarian state ruling a new Roman Empire. General Baratieri was court-martialed. While he was acquitted, the tribunal said that Italy regretted trusting a general who had shown himself so entirely unfitted to cope with the exigencies of the situation. He never accepted responsibility for the defeat, blaming the cowardice of his troops for letting him down. He even created his own racial hierarchy of cowardice, with the worst being the local Africans, then the southern Italians, and lastly northern Italians. Emperor Menelik would rule Ethiopia until his death in 1913. Razakula died fighting at the head of his troops in another conflict, a fitting end for Ethiopia's top general. To his dying day, his greatest regret was not getting his hands on General Baratieri. You and me both, Razakula, you and me both. The Battle of Adowa changed Italian and Ethiopian history forever. Ethiopia would remain independent, one of only 2 African countries not to be colonized. The European empires flocked to recognize the new East African power, and it entered the community of nations. Italy recognized its independence, but would keep Eritrea. For Italy, this war would poison the young nation. The defeat inflicted a deep wound on the national psyche that wouldn't heal. There was an ever-present urge to avenge Adowa and prove Italy was a great power. It was the perfect breeding ground for the rise of fascism after World War I, as a new Italian regime turned its baleful eye towards Ethiopia again. But that is for another time. Over here in the UK, it is the Easter bank holiday, so my schedule has changed slightly due to family obligations. The next episode will be on the 1st of May. We'll head to the small Caribbean island of Grenada for a tale involving space aliens, voodoo, revolution and Cold War intrigue. After that, we will start the second Opium War series on the 8th of May. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.